What's Daniel Day-Lewis really like? I haven't a clue, which is why he's so great. Because when he plays Lincoln, I only see Lincoln. I don't think, well, there's a British heterosexual. But Hanks says, I don't think people would accept the inauthenticity of a straight guy playing a gay guy because, quote, we're beyond that now. Don't get him started on bosom buddies. I mean, really? Does Forrest Gump get thrown under the bus too because Tom isn't really mentally challenged? And as far as we're beyond that, no. No, that implies progress. This is the opposite. This is regression. And it is, frankly, typical of so much wokeness that doesn't build on liberalism. It undoes it. Empathy, putting yourself in someone else's place so you can understand them better, used to be the very heart of liberalism. Now it's considered offensive because don't even try to put yourself in my shoes because you could never know. What a bunch of bullshit that always was. Of course, no one can ever know exactly what another person's struggle is, but we try. Black Like Me was a 1950s book about a white man who darkened his skin and went out into society because he wanted to understand what his black brothers and sisters were up against. Today, all the woke mob would see about that was a guy who did blackface. Steven Spielberg recently remade West Side Story and bent over backwards to respect ethnicities and ended up pleasing nobody. And it's too bad because the original musical was created by Stephen Sondheim, Arthur Lawrence, and Leonard Bernstein, three gay Jews.
Good morning. It's Saturday, Enemies of My Country Saturday, November the 18th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the Song of the Day, we will have rules for radical conservatives, rules for retrogrades, rules for patriots, no free lunch, Leo Terrell, Vivek Ramaswamy, and the enemies of my country. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I shouldn't change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. And now there's no free lunch, 250 Economic Truths by David Bahnsen.
In every age, everybody knows that up to his own time, progressive improvement has been taking place. Nobody seems to reckon on any improvement in the next generation. We cannot absolutely prove that those are in error who say society has reached a turning point, that we have seen our best days. But so said all who came before us, and with just as much apparent reason. On what principle is it that with nothing but improvement behind us, we are to expect nothing but deterioration before us? Thomas Babington Macaulay. Those who bemoan the future conditions of despair that free enterprise are sure to produce environmentally, socially, morally, boldly do so against the testimony of history and common sense.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, rules for radical conservatives.
That Sweden was a country, like most European nation-states, of cousins, who shared a common language, culture, history, and gene pool. It was not a racist cliché to assume that many Swedes were in fact tall, blonde, and good-looking. It was a fact. But now, the definition of ethnicity has been changed, in part to reflect that all the European countries are undergoing a demographic and immigration-driven hollowing out, and that what we used to think of as being quintessentially British, Italian, or even German will no longer be true in the future, if it even still is. And that henceforth, you will be blinded to the demographic changes going on across the pond and right here at home. And the media leads the way. That's why charges of racism fly so freely today, nearly a half-century after Dr. King's great speech on the Mall in Washington. A sports coach, in the heat of the moment, calls a fan shouting insults a fat Mexican, and he is fired, even though the fan may well have been A, fat, and B, a Mexican. It's racism. Anyone opposing the policies of a black elected official can automatically be deemed guilty of racism, no matter what the merits of the disagreement or even the facts. And henceforth, all Swedes are presumed to have no distinguishing shared physical characteristics at all. And you'd best wrap your mind around this brave new world if you know what's good for you. The media, like the generals, loves to fight the last war. And it's clear from a close reading of the New York Times that for decades its editors have been waking up every day and wondering whether it's 1943, with the Holocaust still raging, although they are, like the bien-pensant everywhere, vehemently anti-Israel, go figure, or 1963, with Bull Connor, a Democrat of course, turning fire hoses on black people. Today, journalists will not rest until they root out every last vestige of racism and hate in America, even if they have to invent them. Indeed, we are witnessing another perfect storm, a mighty nor'easter of corrupt, we prefer the term opportunistic, as in George Washington Plunkett's famous aphorism about honest graft, I seen my opportunities and I took them. Journalists salivating at the prospect of getting to cover the only beat that matters anymore, which is the Washington beat, more accurately, the White House beat. And politicians only too willing to dangle the carrot of access in exchange for, well, obedience. For here is the dirty little secret of most reporters. Deep down, they wish they were something else. Anything else, like real writers, political consultants, President of the United States. Like sports writers, they spend so much time hanging around people who are actually doing something, like running a baseball team, that they begin to imagine that they could do it equally well, if not better. And thus, rotisserie league baseball was born. Worse, as reporters began to get face time on the Sunday shows and then on the cable networks, they began to take themselves more and more seriously. Today, they are no longer reporters, they're journalists. No longer grubby little men in cheap suits and battered fedoras with a tattered press pass in the hat band, but players. Men and women whose opinions matter. Indeed, half the cable talk shows in the evening now consist of one talking head interviewing another talking head, usually a colleague on the same network. A perfect circle of jerks. And no journalists, of course, are worse than that special blend of lickspittle and sycophant, of plotter and Polonius, known as the Washington correspondent. Nursing their deeply held grudges against the world, convinced that they could be doing a better job running the country than the idiots in charge, keenly aware of the constantly shifting balances of power in the Medici court, at which they fancy themselves courtiers but are treated like jesters, they now proudly take their places on panels opposite politicians, their received wisdom greeted as blindly original thinking, their Pulitzer Prizes handed back and forth among the same group of people as if they were ghastly gifts at a recycling party. It's probably only a matter of time before one of them declares his or her candidacy, receives the plaudits of the minitudes in the briefing room, and then is astonished to find that he has absolutely no constituency outside of the newsroom. But until that day comes, the illusion will persist. Even worse, Gaia forbid, some of them want to be screenwriters. In the early days of Hollywood, most of the scenarists, as we were called back then, were in fact moonlighting reporters from the big city dailies. Schmucks with Underwoods, typewriters to those of you under 90, as one studio chief famously called the ink-stained wretches. Indeed, when Ben Hecht was summoned by Herman Mankiewicz westward from Chicago to work on a movie, the cable read, "Millions are to be grabbed out here, and your only competition is idiots." Once word got out, reporters flocked to the City of Angels, eager to get at some of that moolah. And they've been doing it ever since. Especially those losers who stayed put on the east side of the Potomac, in the city most definitely not of the Angels, Washington, D.C. To the untrained eye, what we lefty American media types and our ink-stained comrades everywhere do may look like storytelling. And, in a manner of speaking, it is. The stories, written by our trained media seals, have characters, events, incidents, action. Most important, though, is the fact that our stories, like fables and fairy tales everywhere, have narrative. A framework of good guys and bad guys, archetypes and stereotypes. A shorthand for our audiences, so that instead of wasting time on establishing characters, we can get right to the morality play propaganda point, all the while disguising it as news or entertainment. The narrative is like a continuing serial or soap opera, which our audiences can drop in and out of, secure in the knowledge that they know what's going on. Thus, urban minorities equal good. White ethnics equal bad. Corporate chieftains equal bad. Union leaders equal good. Brave Hollywood screenwriters speaking truth to Bush equal good. Limbaugh, Hannity, O'Reilly equals bad. It really is that simple. And as the most recent presidential election return showed, that effective. Which brings me to the heart and soul of our narrative, the key proposition that until recently, we were too skittish to actually articulate clearly in front of the American people. For decades, even centuries, we've been afraid that some backwoodsman Natty Bumpo type would hear the words that are about to come out of my word processor, and soon out of the mouths of our outliers, and sick the last of the Mohicans on us. Or if not Chingachgook himself, then Horatio Alger, or Jack Armstrong, or any of the other all-American boys you used to look up to. Heroes who made their own way in the world, and who inspired others to do so. Hell, once upon a time, there were even a few reporters like that. The great Henry Morton Stanley, the Welshman who uttered the famous words, "Dr. Livingston, I presume," was acting as a reporter for the New York Herald when he braved the dangers of darkest Africa to find the good doctor by the shores of Lake Tanganyika in 1871. Imagine Howard Feynman doing that. On the other hand, it's easy to imagine Feynman or any of the other wizened, bookish, non-Ernie Pyle types who now make up the nation's press corps actually uttering these words. Socialism equals good, capitalism equals bad. As Mark Levin might shout, "There, I said it." From FDR on, we tested that meme on America, hoping against hope that one day the time would be right for you to accept it. Roosevelt reached out to the little guy in those fireside chats, all the while staying up nights thinking of ways to screw him. Social Security, the mother of all Ponzi schemes, began to chip away at the Bumponian tradition of self-reliance. The regulatory agencies began to snake their tentacles across the land, coming first in the guise of benefactors, the Tennessee Valley Authority bringing electricity to the Walker Percy hillbillies, and then as the commissars of the new regime. In Hollywood, we embraced our Soviet allies in movies like Mission to Moscow and battled the House Un-American Activities Committee in the pages of the press and on radio and television. We tarnished tail gunner Joe McCarthy's name forever, made him, without any historical justification, the bad guy responsible for the Hollywood blacklist, even though it was the studio moguls who did that, not politicians, and whitewashed Bobby Kennedy's relationship with the Wisconsin drunk, senator. Hell, we even got a Pulitzer Prize for one of the great fellow travelers, Walter Duranty, who did his level best in the pages of, where else, the New York Times, to conceal the so-called crimes of Joseph Stalin from the American people. And then in 1944, with the World War still raging, there was the Second Bill of Rights, proposed by Roosevelt in his State of the Union address. At the time he made the speech, FDR had already violated an unwritten constitutional rule, one that limited the chief executive to no more than 2 consecutive terms in the White House. It had been good enough for George Washington, good enough for Thomas Jefferson, but it wasn't good enough for the indispensable man Roosevelt. Later that same year, he ran for and won his 4th presidential election, although he died a few months after his inauguration. But with the outcome of the war very much in doubt, D-Day was still months away. Roosevelt might have had his legacy on his mind as he proposed the following new economic Bill of Rights. The right to a useful and remunerative job in the industries or shops or farms or mines of the nation. The right to earn enough to provide adequate food and clothing and recreation.
And that was part of the next part of Chapter 11 of Rules for Radical Conservatives by David Kahane. Thank you. And now, Rules for Retrogrades, 40 Tactics to Defeat the Radical Left.
Rule 19. The retrograde must loudly mock the general idiocy of the moral reasoning of the 1960s, especially boomerisms involving sexuality, courtship, and family planning. Think of all the mortal dangers the radicals of that generation have normalized, popularized, and passed into the next generation through the repetition of their harmless-sounding, yet fatal slogans. College students should live their lives before they meet someone. Before marriage, young people should travel and experience the world. Young people should learn by experience what they like and dislike romantically. In each of these, early and procreative marriage is clearly discouraged. Fertility is consistently handled as an inconvenience at best. Each platitude sends the clear message that marriage and family will prove to be a drag, and that life inheres in self-involvement and recreation rather than marital vocation. Additionally, vested within any given boomerism, offset by a sort of weaponized ambiguity, there's always 2 components. A, some oblique reference to experience, which somehow supposedly contradicts axiomatic moral reasoning, as if one has to try heroin in order to know that it is mortally perilous. B, an encouragement toward sexual promiscuity or contraceptivity, carried by the boomerism's reference to experience. In other words, boomerisms express an imagined inverse correlation between life experience and monogamy. These platitudes invariably stand for the proposition that sexual purity of all sorts is an admirable ideal, well, sort of, which doesn't usually work out for most people. The retrograde's job inheres in highlighting, in private and public dialogue, that sex and procreation are indispensably linked in nature. Whenever human beings have ventured away from the procreative Christian norms of sexuality, celibacy until the wedding day, and chastity thereafter, catastrophe has devastated the population. In other words, the retrograde must deliver the message that sexual purity is not only for religious people, it is for all people interested in living a happy, fulfilling life. Not to mention, such boomerisms strongly work in the direction of the sociological phenomenon called arrested development, addressed further in the following rule, whereby a childish man is not presumed to come of age until he reaches his 30s or even his 40s. Purveyors of boomerisms obsessively remind their offspring and grandchildren that they will not tender to them any moral advice, and they'll do so just before or after tendering to their offspring or grandchildren the above bad moral advice. They make these specious claims on the ground that the youngest generation must live their own lives and find out for themselves, which is a performed, oxymoronic way of solidifying the bad advice they just gave. The retrograde must announce loudly that the sun has risen and set on this anti-virtue signaling by the ironically titled baby boomer generation. Truly, history will know them as the generation by and for the radical culture of death lobby, which manipulated statecraft, warcraft, and even witchcraft, not to mention the globalist popular culture, to turn young, fertile couples against their procreative vocation. The baby boom generation represented, historically speaking, the terminal end of a widespread culture of life throughout all of human history until roughly 1970. Upon becoming parents to young adults in the 1990s and early 2000s, boomers, liberals, moderates, and conservatives alike, customarily instructed their offspring with the deadly advice not to marry and procreate until the middling years of adulthood, wherein fertility rates have plummeted. See the next rule. Their justification for this advice usually involved acquisitive lifestyle accoutrements and existential-sounding platitudes like finding out who you really are or finding your freedom before being tied down to another person. Now, not all boomers are radicals, of course, but all of them lived and watched impotently amid the dispiriting radical 1960s takeover of Western civilization. Accordingly, there seems to be near ubiquitous generational psychic scarring from living under such a repressive, subversive regime, the boomerisms of which have by now outlived many of the boomers themselves, lasting over 2 generations. Even amongst non-radical members of the generation, boomerisms have produced a widespread generational ethos matching the tone of the militant moderates described above. Even many so-called conservative boomers, though not all, usually subscribe to the above experientialist, existentialist, libertine platitudes when it comes to dating or family planning. The retrograde can overcome these moral toxins simply by announcing to his elder relatives that he is going in a different direction, which, after all, they ought to well understand. There are countless hippie songs about just such a thing.
And that was Rules for Retrogrades, Rule 19, 40 Tactics to Defeat the Radical Left by Timothy and David Gordon. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, Rules for Patriots by Steve Deese.
And it's only with the right worldview that one acquires the correct courage of conviction. A politician has positions, but a statesman has convictions and pledges his life, fortune, and sacred honor to defend and advance them. Unfortunately, the other side has more statesmen, albeit of the wrong conviction, than we do. They would rather shut down the government than stop funding the child killers at Planned Parenthood with taxpayer dollars. Our side responds by extending the debt ceiling to avoid a government shutdown, thus filling Planned Parenthood's coffers with the taxpayers' money once more. They lose 31 consecutive elections on the definition of marriage, and their leaders keep coming back for more. We win 31 consecutive elections on marriage, and our leaders want to run away and hide from the issue. or start a super PAC to support destroying marriage. Although it's misplaced and morally flawed, the left is demonstrating more courage of conviction than we are. And as long as that is the case, we're going to keep losing ground in the culture as well as at the polls. Look at taxes and spending. Most Americans instinctively know the growth of government is out of control. But when you look at the real numbers, it's even worse than most of us realize. In 1980, the federal government collected $244 billion from individual taxpayers. Just 30 years later, in 2010, that number climbed to just over $2.3 trillion. Keep in mind, this is only individual income taxes and doesn't count Social Security, capital gains, or other taxes like excise taxes, which are applied to things like gasoline, firearms, and other weapons, tobacco, alcohol, tires, trucks, and fishing equipment. King George III had nothing on Washington, D.C. The $700 billion increase in the federal budget under President George W. Bush was far and away the biggest in American history at the time, until Barack Obama's spending spree, that is. Despite the fact none of Obama's proposed bloated budgets have made it into law, don't forget now, the Democrats didn't even vote for them when they were in the majority. The deficit has reached 100% of our gross domestic product, which is the total market value of a nation's combined goods and services. We have become, in every sense of the term, a debtor nation. Look at the inalienable right to life. Did you know the income for Planned Parenthood, America's top infanticide merchant, increased by 24%, and its government subsidies have grown by 33% since 2005 alone? More revenue has allowed Planned Parenthood to get even more gruesomely innovative in its brutality. After the slaughter of over 50 million children, life is so disregarded now that child killing via abortion is available via teleconference. A 2011 Rasmussen poll found that most Americans consider themselves pro-choice in favor of killing children, but also found abortion immoral in most circumstances. Now that is some real moral confusion right there. Look at the family. According to a 2010 study, the out-of-wedlock birth rate in the United States has skyrocketed from 28% in 1990 to an incredible 41% today. The out-of-wedlock birth rate 30 years ago was 19.6%. Translation, despite much more awareness, acceptance, and access to birth control, as well as millions of taxpayer dollars invested in abstinence programs, more and more children in this country are conceived by parents who are not married. The current divorce rate in America for first-time marriages is 41%. For second marriages, it's 60%. And for third marriages, it's 73%. While divorce rates did decline from 1981 to 1990, for the first time in American history, a couple is just as likely to be parted by divorce on average as by death. Also, for the first time in American history, married couples are the minority, with the majority of American adults either living together or remaining single. How about education? It's the single biggest industry behind energy in America, and it's one of the largest total expenditures for government at all levels. Nonetheless, the government education system in America, as depicted by must-see films like Waiting for Superman, is a pandemic of failure. Much of the hand-wringing is over American students' paltry proficiency in math and science. But the real concern again comes down to worldview. A recent Department of Education survey found history is the weakest subject among American students. Only 20% of sixth graders, 17% of eighth graders, and 12% of high school seniors demonstrate a solid grasp on their nation's history, which means they grow increasingly ignorant the longer they're in school. A majority of fourth graders didn't know why Abraham Lincoln was important. Nearly 80% of 12th graders incorrectly identified North Korea's ally against the U.S. in the Korean War, despite the fact it was a multiple-choice question. In 2011, Newsweek administered the U.S. citizenship test to 1,000 American citizens, and the results were tragic. Here are just a few examples. 33% of Americans could not identify when the Declaration of Independence was signed. 65% of Americans couldn't say what happened at the Constitutional Convention. 80% of Americans didn't know who was president during World War I. In 2012, Xavier University did its own national poll of Americans using 10 questions from the U.S. citizenship test. only 1 in 3 Americans correctly answered at least 6 of the questions, which is required for a passing score. The results go downhill from there. 59% of Americans could not name one enumerated power of the federal government found in the U.S. Constitution. 62% of Americans could not name the governor of their state. 85% of Americans did not know the meaning of, quote, the rule of law. 75% of Americans could not answer the question, what does the judiciary branch do? 71% of Americans were unable to identify the Constitution as the supreme law of the land. 62% of Americans could not name at least one of their 2 U.S. senators. And 62% of Americans could not name the current Speaker of the House. Can you say low information voter? I knew you could. As if all this data weren't depressing enough. In 2011, the Intercollegiate Studies Institute surveyed 165 Americans who have been elected to public office. Here are some of those findings. Only 49% of them could name all 3 branches of government. Only 46% knew that Congress, not the president, has the power to declare war. Only 15% knew the phrase separation of church and state never appears in the Constitution. Only 15%. Only 57% knew what the Electoral College was, and 20% of those that didn't thought it was a school for training those aspiring for higher political office. In other words, our politicians are even more ignorant about whom we are and how we're supposed to govern ourselves than the American people are. The dumber we become, the bigger the government gets, because we can't have self-government if we don't know what the government is supposed to do. How can we possibly expect to successfully defend America's traditions and ideals when most Americans don't even know what they are? This reminds me of a private roundtable with former Speaker Newt Gingrich I once sat in on. And Gingrich made the observation, we're never going to decentralize power away from the Beltway and empower self-government again until the American people become much more informed and much more involved. If freedom and liberty are always just a generation away from being lost, then it appears in the last generation we've completely lost our moral compass that makes freedom and liberty possible in the first place, which means we've got a generation to recover before we cease being citizens and start being subjects. A lot of you reading this already possess that sense of urgency, as the mounting Republican casualties in primaries nationwide prove. We're spurred to action, but now we need to channel that sense of urgency and courage of conviction into something sustainable and constructive over the long term. Lots of books, blogs, and talk radio programs are done by conservatives each day discussing what needs to be done, why it needs to be done, and who needs to do it. Unfortunately, there's very little done on how to make it happen. Until now.
And that was Chapter 3 of Rules for Patriots, How Conservatives Can Win Again by Steve Deese. Back in a minute. Thank you. So here's an example of truly conservative communication. Also on X, Leo Terrell from his account. Shut up, Al. And he's talking about Al Sharpton. Shut up, Al. You call yourself a preacher, a man of God. You hate Jews. You shake down corporations for money. You lied about rape. You are a race hustler. Shut up. And a couple of things on that. Number one is that it's unambiguous. We know exactly what he's trying to say, who he's talking about, what it is that they did, and what he's recommending that they do about it, i.e. shut up. And by the way, a lot of people are afraid to use the term shut up. They've been intimidated because people on the left say, I have a freedom of speech. Well, if you ever hear that, you tell somebody to shut up and they say, I got freedom of speech, you say, so do I. And I have the freedom to tell you to shut up. So good for Mr. Terrell for doing that. Back in a minute. Thank you. So now a statement by, and a little analysis, but a statement by Vivek Ramaswamy on X. Here's the ugly truth. Quote, here's the ugly truth. The anti-racist woke BS from the last 3 years planted the seeds for today's anti-Semitism. Yet, liberal groups like ADL, who propped up BLM, are the ones now crying foul. They're insinuating that Elon Musk is an anti-Semite to deflect accountability for their own failures. It's disgusting and needs to stop. Now, there's a lot of words in there that make this sound like it's it gives it the ring of a value statement, but it's not. It's a statement that's completely devoid of value, and it's devoid of value because it's deterministic. It suggests that things happen on their own. For instance, he said, the anti-racist woke BS from the last 3 years planted the seeds for today's anti-Semitism. So here's a thing that is not a sentient life form that is creating another thing. That's what determinism is. It says that nobody has any free will, that people do what they do because they're forced to by forces or powers beyond their control. Somebody else forces me to buy an automobile, for instance. It's the gas companies, the evil big gas and big oil and big car that force me to buy gasoline-powered automobiles. It is big tobacco that forces me to buy cigarettes and cigars and other tobacco products and smoke and harm my health. So, and it's obvious BS. Here's the only time he alludes to an individual or group, which is what he should have done all the way throughout. He says, like ADL, which is the Anti-Defamation League, who propped up BLM, Black Lives Matter, and is always best, by the way, to spell it out. So we know that you're talking about the same BLM I'm thinking about. I assume he means Black Lives Matter, and ADL, I assume he means the Anti-Defamation League, are the ones now crying foul. They're insinuating. So now we get that they're doing something, that Elon Musk is an anti-Semite to deflect accountability for their own failures. But he comes up now with an explanation which weakens his argument. It's disgusting. And I'm assuming it's means the deflection is disgusting and needs to stop. But it's the whole statement is weak, is incredibly weak. He would have been better off to say from the top, anti-racist woke BS. Okay, who planted the seeds for today's anti-Semitism? Who is it that created the anti-racist woke BS? Who? Name somebody. Let's say the ADL. The ADL created an anti-racist woke BS from the last 3 years. The ADL planted, therefore, the seeds for today's anti-Semitism, and now the ADL is crying foul. The ADL insinuated that Elon Musk is an anti-Semite. The ADL is disgusting, and the ADL needs to and not be held accountable, because again, that's a statement that leaves you with the question, by whom? For what? The ADL needs to make amends. That's a much better way. So that's a much better way to put it. And your whole statement becomes potent. It's potent, it's conservative, it's truly conservative to put it that way. Whereas Vivek Ramaswamy, his statement is heavily influenced by the left. This is the way the left likes to communicate, with not pointing fingers at anybody. See, everything and if you don't point fingers, it means that everything just sort of happens. You get up in the morning and there's anti-Semitism or woke BS. You wake up in the morning and there's all of a sudden there's anti-Semitism. You wake up in the morning and all of a sudden there's problems on the X platform. And that's not the way it is. Life doesn't work that way. You don't wake up and just find yourself in the middle of an issue or a problem. Somebody created it. John F. Kennedy, former president of the United States, had it right when he said things don't just happen, they're made to happen. So we figure out who made them happen, and then we criticize those people if what they've made to happen is bad, of course. So, back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the enemies of my country.
15.
Duchess checked the wall clock, weighing the local time in Syria against U.S. Eastern Standard Time as it applied to her at CIA headquarters and, more importantly, her Senate counterpart in D.C. The UAV rep turned in his seat, speaking the words that Duchess had been dreading. UAV is offline. Duchess looked to the central flat screen, catching her last glimpse of the 2 flatbed trucks and their armed escort of 4 technical vehicles, traveling north as fast as they could manage on the potholed desert road. They vanished as the UAV banked right, the horizon on screen tilting out of sight until only the night sky was visible. Now her OPSIN was timing the duration from losing visual with the UAV to reestablishing it with the inbound drones and fighter jets. Every second added to that count strained her ability to engage the trucks with an airstrike, added room for doubt as to whether the rockets would still be aboard by then. Only a detailed bomb damage assessment would be able to say for sure, and even then, the number of rockets destroyed could well remain forever unknown. Duchess announced, "Sutherland and Farr, approach the bench. I'm ready for your brief." The pair of men rose from their adjacent workstations and quickly ascended the platforms to her desk. They looked like a study in opposites. Brian Sutherland was a youthful-looking, clean-shaven man in his 40s. He laid a map before her, using a pen to point at a road junction at the village just north of the flatbed's current location. "This is where the road splits in Deshar. That gives us 2 likely routes, and we won't know which one the trucks will take, or if they'll split up, until our incoming birds arrive and establish positive identification." Duchess nodded, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Sutherland was her JTAC, an acronym for Joint Terminal Attack Controller, an expert in the art and science of calling in close air support. He'd earned his bones at the ground level of special operations, first as an Air Force combat controller, and later as an instructor evaluator at the schoolhouse. His active duty service consisted of calling in bombs and strafing runs while fighting alongside Green Berets and Navy SEALs, making him an ideal candidate for the agency's JTAC requirements. Now that he no longer served on the front lines, but from an OPSIN at CIA headquarters, he was tasked with the neurosurgery of close air support, directing fighters and bombers from thousands of miles away, relying on aerial surveillance and ground observer reporting to deliver precision ordnance at the ragged fringe of agency authorities. For this reason, his desk was located alongside that of the second man now standing at his side. Sutherland continued, "But the truck's location, or locations plural, will determine how to proceed." Duchess's shoulders fell. She knew where this conversation was heading. "Let me guess. Nearest location of Allied forces?" "That's right, ma'am," Sutherland said. "If the trucks follow the northwest route, they'll be approaching a Special Forces ODA in Iskar. Once they break a 5-mile barrier, we can justify close air support using Type 3 terminal attack control with blanket weapon release clearance in defense of U.S. forces. That's our strongest legal justification, and it's pretty airtight." "And the other possibility?" He shifted the tip of his pen on the map. "One or both trucks take the northeast route instead. They don't pass within 5 miles of any Allied forces, which removes our ability to justify close air support. We'd have to switch to AI instead." "AI?" The man beside him finally spoke. "Air interdiction," he said flatly, and Duchess watched him closely for an explanation. In contrast to Sutherland, Gregory Farr was in his 60s. With his slicked-back silver hair and graying beard, he looked like the aging patriarch of a biker gang. Which, to an extent, he was, though it consisted of a group of his professional peers, most of whom looked considerably more bureaucratic than he did. Farr was an agency lawyer, and he possessed decades of experience with the Byzantine and often conflicting legal restrictions that governed covert action abroad. His role was to know every line of fine print legalese that Duchess couldn't understand even if she had the time to read it all, seamlessly translating the authorities into clear, actionable guidelines. Farr knew exactly what Duchess could legally approve, what she couldn't, and what fell into the nebulous gray area that could contribute either to mission success, the end of her career, or both, depending on which way the political winds were drifting. She asked, "Why haven't I heard of air interdiction before?" "Because it's a last resort, ma'am," Farr replied quietly. "In the AI scenario, we'd be legally justifying the strike as destroying enemy military potential before it can be used against friendly forces. We'd be within our authorities, roughly speaking, but this scenario is subject to being dissected 36 ways by every possible level of oversight. If the bomb damage assessment doesn't reveal any evidence of the rockets being on board the trucks, and especially if this hits the news, the Oversight Committee, and Gosweiler in particular, are going to be looking for any possible way to distance themselves from your decision. Duchess nodded, glancing to the wall clock and considering the timing of Gosweiler's next check-in. Have both scripts ready to go. Barring any updates to the intelligence picture, I plan to authorize either scenario. Or, if the trucks split up, both. 16. Ian's team arrived at the mechanic shop at 4:15 in the morning. The sky was still dark, though Ian grimly considered that they were losing that advantage by the minute as sunrise approached. Once that happened, things were going to get complicated for 5 white men desperately trying to blend in. Granted, Nizar had provided much of his wardrobe to help with the effort, but to Ian, the results were predictably disheartening. His team looked like a ragtag gang of homeless militia, the tan fatigues they'd arrived in now supplemented with checkered scarves called kefiyehs, along with Nizar's unbuttoned overshirts and windbreakers worn atop tactical gear. The process would have been much easier if they could have simply donned full-body burqas, but aside from perhaps Ian's wiry frame, no one on the team was in any danger of passing for a woman. As Nizar, David, and Ian approached the door, the remaining 3 men spread out into a loose defensive formation facing the dark street. Nizar gave 3 hard raps on the door. As they waited for the mechanic to answer, Ian considered the few advantages they had. The locals in this part of the country wore clothes ranging from traditional Arab garb to Western casual. Most importantly, to hear Nizar tell it, was that the civilian populace tended not to let their gazes linger on anyone with a gun. There was such a wide spectrum of Syrian government forces, fractured ISIS militias, and resistance fighters roving throughout the country that you could more or less wear whatever you wanted without drawing attention. That is, right up until the moment you encountered armed fighters representing one side or another, at which point the situation became considerably more dire. When Nizar knocked a second time without response, David whispered, "I thought you said this guy could deliver. If he's already bailed, I'm going to be pissed." Ian knew that being pissed was the last of his team leader's concerns at present. If this mechanic had decided to turn on them in the minutes since Nizar called, the odds of him not ratting out the team for some ISIS bounty were slim to none, and they were stepping into an ambush. But Nizar shook his head. "He hates ISIS more than anyone, but he is too smart. Be careful what you say around him. In any case, he will probably read your thoughts." "What do you mean, read my—" It was too late for David to finish the sentence. The door creaked open, held by a single figure that Ian couldn't make out in the darkness beyond. David didn't hesitate, entering with Nizar as Ian hastened to follow with Cancer, Riley, and Worthy collapsing their formation to slip inside. The smells of oil, gasoline, and rusting metal were thick in the stale air, and when the last man entered, the door swung shut behind them and locked. Only then did their host flip on the light switch, illuminating a dank workshop packed with vehicles, motor parts, and toolboxes. Ian got his first look at the man who'd let them inside. The mechanic was short and squat, with a wide nose set over a bushy gray beard. His squinting eyes leisurely passed over the men, as if the 4:00 a.m. arrival of an American paramilitary team were a routine occurrence. Ian had worked his fair share of intelligence sources and immediately assessed the abject lack of moral struggle in the mechanic's eyes, the self-assuredness he projected despite being immediately surrounded by armed men. It took Ian 2 seconds to arrive at the conclusion that he was dealing with a ruthless opportunist, and that could be a very dangerous thing. David spoke at once. "What vehicles are we taking?" The mechanic swung a weathered hand across the tight confines of the shop as he replied in heavily accented English, "These Toyotas are my most reliable." He was pointing toward two Land Cruiser SUVs, one silver and the other white, appearing in decent condition given the country they resided in. Fully fueled. I said I would fill them up, and I did. You may take as many gas cans as you wish from the back of my shop. Cancer spoke to his men. Get the gear loaded. Split Team 1 in the white truck, split Team 2 in the gray one. As Worthy and Riley began shuttling the team's rucksacks aboard, Cancer took a step toward the trucks. The mechanic's hand shot out to stop Cancer, and then he stepped closer before inhaling deeply through his nose. You smell like cigarettes, my friend. American cigarettes. Camels? Cancer's brow furrowed in irritation. Do I look like I'm trying to live forever? Marlboro Reds, Jack. The mechanic smiled. Perhaps some nicotine would help me wake up. Perhaps these rust heaps get us where we need to go, and I'll fucking think about it. Then he gently pushed the man aside, proceeding to help Riley and Worthy load the trucks. David intervened, extending his hand to the mechanic. I'm David. The man shook it. Elias. What kind of work did you do for Syrian intelligence? Ian asked. The question provoked a phlegming noise from Elias, somewhere between a cough and a laugh, and he tapped his chest with a fist as if trying to clear some obstruction. I hunted the enemies of my country, he said, fixing Ian with his stare. Just as I suspect you do. Nizar quickly cut in, seeming to sense that this line of inquiry would produce less than favorable results. Elias, thank you for your help. You were the only one I could turn to. Then Elias responded with a rapid-fire question in Arabic, and Ian interrupted before Nizar could reply. Gentlemen, he said, please communicate in English so we can understand as well. Elias shot him an angry glare. I said, what is in this for you? Then he looked back to Nizar and repeated, and so, my friend, what is in it for you? Nizar shook his head. It is not important. These men need our help. Elias narrowed his gaze. Since I have never known you to care about money, Nizar, then I guess you have a trip to America all lined up for your family. Nodding, he turned to David and said, this sounds nice. I will have one too, please. One what? Trip to America. But I will make it easy on you. The arrangement will be for me alone. Do we have a deal? David said, we can discuss this later. This is a matter of urgency. You have no idea how urgent it is. Elias cut him off. If you seek a man responsible for transport of a cargo that was very nearly captured already, who do you think will be the first to die when these men try to cover their tracks? He gave a short, rasping laugh. It has been some time since my work in Syrian intelligence, but my ignorant mechanic's guess is that the logistician responsible for facilitating the transport will be quite high on that list. We will very likely arrive to find him dead already. 17. Joanne's eyes darted across the screens at the front of the Opsen, now filled with the camera feeds of UAVs streaking over northwestern Syria. The first UAV to arrive had gone to Dashar, where the road diverged, starting at the village's center and flying concentric circles outward with the first priority of locating the two flatbed trucks and, barring that, identifying any evidence of rocket transfer. But that first surveillance platform had thus far observed only normal pattern-of-life activities within the village, transmitted in black and white images across the central flat screen. The others were sweeping up the two main roads, searching for any trace of the flatbeds. Then she heard the ground team leader transmit, Suicide element is en route to logistician using locally procured vehicles and guides, ETA just under 2 hours. Seated beside Joanne, Duchess lifted the hand mic and transmitted back. Raptor 9-1 copies all. You are cleared to continue pursuit using maximum possible discretion. Discretion is our middle name. Suicide out. This comment made a faint grin appear on Joanne's face as Duchess set down her hand mic. I'm glad you told them about the logistician. So am I, Duchess responded, her voice trembling with relief. But there was nothing to be relieved about yet, Joanne thought. That ground team could get rolled up at any moment, and while they were non-attributable to the agency, even accounting for China's data hack which was no small achievement. They were still Americans, and to Joanne, that made them the same as any active duty service member she'd sent into battle. Before she could consider the thought any longer, Sutherland shouted, "We've got visual. Looks like both trucks passed through Dashar and are on the northeast route. No U.S. or coalition forces ahead, so the strike would have to be authorized under air interdiction guidelines." All eyes turned to the central screen as the image flashed from the orbiting view of Dashar to the feed from a new camera, this one sweeping up a road toward the distant shapes of two flatbed trucks. The 4 escorting pickups were nowhere in sight, and that bore dire consequences for their ability to authorize an airstrike, provided, of course, these were the same flatbeds in the first place. "Fidelity?" Duchess asked. "On it. We'll advise when able." The analysts were capturing screenshots from the UAV feed, comparing them to previous images from the last surveillance platform before it went offline. Within a minute, the lead analyst announced, "Side-by-side imagery of physical markings and thermal signature puts us at 90% fidelity that these are the same vehicles." Sutherland turned in his seat to face Duchess. "Concur, ma'am. I've got more than enough for PID." Beside him, Farr shot a silent thumbs up. Joanne watched Duchess close her eyes and breathe an exalted sigh. PID, positive identification, was exactly what they needed. Duchess had just gotten her airstrike. "What about the armed escort vehicles?" "No sign of them," Sutherland replied. "Best guess is they waved off in or around Dashar and are currently in hiding to minimize signature of the cargo trucks." The only question now, Joanne thought, was whether the rockets were still aboard. "How are we looking with the cargo?" Sutherland gave a confident nod. "We've assessed the truck's speed against the distance traveled. Bottom line, if they stopped at any point since we lost visual, it wasn't for long. Less than 10 minutes, tops. And with ISR continuing to observe normal pattern of life over the only likely transfer point at Dashar, I'd put our odds at 70% that the rockets are still aboard those flatbeds. I want PID handed off to the F-15s as soon as they've got eyes on. Priority of fire is lead vehicle, followed by trail, as close to simultaneous hits as they can manage. We've got continuous coverage lined up from here on out?" "Yes, ma'am. I'll be able to rotate surveillance with Gray Eagles and maintain strike capability on site between Predator and Reaper flights. I want the flatbeds destroyed with a small enough munition to leave some evidence for the BDA. What do you recommend?" "Based on loadout and given that both targets are moving, our best bet is the AGM-65E2L, which is the laser-guided Maverick missile variant with a 300-pound warhead. They've got a total of 4 on the rails, which gives us 2 shots before they'd have to resort to larger munitions or a strafing run." "Approved. Relay to the pilots and let me know if you get any kickback." "Will do. Fighters will be on station in 3 mics." Joanne had already typed the launch order for the Rangers into her encrypted chat, but waited for Duchess's order before hitting send. When Duchess didn't speak at once, Joanne prompted her, "Want the Rangers inbound for BDA? They've got just under a 2-hour flight time on the MH-47. Duchess, who looked like she'd just been awakened from a dream, quickly nodded. "Confirmed. Get them airborne." Joanne hit send on her message, thinking that the amount of information to process at once was simply too much even for Duchess to manage. With this many moving pieces amid a rapidly escalating situation, they were playing 3-dimensional chess in Syria. But the real players were the Rangers packed into an MH-47 helicopter, currently sitting on the tarmac at FOB Presley, with its refueling probe hooked up to a fuel bladder while the engines idled, prepared for immediate launch. Checking her screen, she said, "They're preparing to take off now." Duchess nodded without speaking, waiting for the next update from Sutherland. It took less than a minute. F-15 flight lead has confirmed all and assesses they should be able to achieve dual impact within a 3-second spread. They've got 6 miles of forward clearance before the next civilian population center, and there's 0 traffic inbound. "Gregory?" The lawyer replied, "It's a clear shot for air interdiction, ma'am." Sutherland added, "PID has been transferred to flight lead. We're offsetting our UAV from the bomb trajectory. 60 seconds to weapons release. Last call." She responded, "Final clearance approved." Whatever amount of time elapsed before the next spoken words in the op-send didn't seem like 60 seconds to Joanne. No matter how many times she'd watched a mission unfold on real-time footage, the magnitude of the ground events was rarely lost on her. She'd attended enough military funerals of the men she'd supported to forever purge herself of achieving total detachment, no matter how far from the fight she was. "Weapons release," Sutherland called out, then repeated the statement a few seconds later. Both air-to-ground missiles were streaking along a laser-guided trajectory, and the op-send went dead quiet, aside from the chatter of the pilots emanating from a speaker box. Joanne knew what would happen next. All too often, footage of the seconds before a bomb or missile impact were filled with people racing away from the target on foot, having detected the noise of the aircraft or the projectile itself hurling through the air toward them. Joanne was never sure which. All she knew was that once the dark figures of humans on the ground scattered like insects, the explosion occurred on screen within 3 seconds or less. Usually, those fleeing figures were unsuccessful, vanishing in the blast despite their best efforts. Occasionally, she could make out a human form half crawling away from the destruction, making a last-ditch effort to survive before succumbing to their wounds. And in some cases, the fastest runners in a group managed to outpace the immediate blast, either vanishing off-screen or, in the event of high-value individuals, being tracked until a second bomb or missile could find its mark. But the men aboard these trucks had no way of knowing what was about to occur. Or maybe they did know and were simply resigned to their fate. Either way, there would be no way to hear the fighters streaking in from 15,000 feet over the sound of truck engines, nor the descent of missiles until they were milliseconds from pummeling into the vehicle. And even if those men knew they were about to die, what choice did they have? They were driving across the open desert, and there was no place to run where the unblinking eye of surveillance aircraft wouldn't find them. Would they even want to survive? Joanne wasn't sure. She only knew that these men were extremists who had, like many of the terrorists she'd targeted in the past, resigned themselves to the prospect of martyrdom in seeking some paradise beyond the confines of their physical existence. In the violent and poverty-ravaged lands where such fighters emerged, the prospect of heaven was a key ingredient in their justification for committing unspeakable atrocities against their fellow human beings. Still, her thoughts were with the men aboard those trucks, considering what life events had transpired from their birth up until the moment of their death. Soon it wouldn't matter. They'd be nothing more than ashes in the desert and forgotten numbers on an agency casualty count. And when it was all over, when the targets were nothing more than human remains smoldering in the dirt of some faraway nation, these same military and agency professionals, herself included, would go to work finding more people to kill. The first missile came streaking in from the bottom of the screen, a pinpoint of light that connected with the lead truck in a dazzling white flash. Then there was nothing but a vast cloud billowing outward, the trail vehicle braking in the final moment before it too vanished in a blossoming fog of sand and smoke. Indistinguishable pieces of metal rocketed up and out of the explosions, pirouetting in spinning arcs until they crashed to the desert in a chaotic perimeter around the vehicle remains. Joanne typed the grid of the impact site, sending it on her encrypted chat to vector in the Ranger platoon currently flying toward the strike zone. Sutherland called, "Both targets destroyed. No survivors visible." Duchess replied, "Keep the fighters orbiting for maximum station time. How's our stack looking? No change to assets. We'll have manned and unmanned ISR rotating for the duration with continuous kinetic option. I want non-stop surveillance until ground forces arrive with strike authority against anyone trying to recover materiel from the site." Then she asked Joanne, "How's our BDA looking?" Joanne replied loudly enough for the rest of the ops to hear, "Rangers are airborne. Flight time is 1 hour, 48 minutes. Then Sutherland confirmed, "I've got comms with the Ranger JTAC and we'll be able to shift air assets as per ground force commander's guidance once they're boots on the ground." Duchess nodded her approval, her face as serene as a woman on her spa day. But Joanne watched that placid expression vanish when a phone on her desk rang. This was the red phone, the one that could never go unanswered. Duchess snatched the receiver. "Duchess here." A long pause as her face became stern, and then, Finally, understand all. She hung up the phone, giving Joanne an irritated glance before turning her attention to the OPSEN staff. I need everyone to prepare a formal brief of your actions and analysis up to this point, she announced, then cleared her throat. Senator Gosweiler is on his way.
And that was chapters 15, 16, and 17 of The Enemies of My Country by Jason Casper. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you to be honest, smart, and beautiful, and remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.